Welcome to this panel discussion, and it's called Democracy Under Siege, Lawyers on the Front Lines of Voting Rights. I'm Kalila Spencer. I am class of 2001, and I am here with Professor Ellen Katz, as well as Elena Beverly, who's also class of 2001, to hear and have a discussion about really voting rights as it stands in today's era, and in particular in light of 2020 and the developments of 2021. For those of you that are aware, Ellen is the Ralph Agler Professor of Law. She writes and teaches about election law, civil rights and remedies, and equal protection. And her scholarship addresses questions of minority representation, political equality, and the role of institutions in crafting and implementing anti-discrimination laws. Ellen has published numerous articles, including an influential empirical study on litigation under the Voting Rights Act. And prior to joining Michigan Law faculty, Ellen practiced as an attorney with the appellate sections of the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Division and its Environment and Natural Resources Division. She was a judicial clerk for Justice Souter of the U.S. Supreme Court and for the Honorable Judith Rogers of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. She earned her JD from Yale in 1994, where she served as the articles editor of the Yale Law Journal, and she graduated summa cum laude, from Yale College in 1991 with a BA in history. And we have Elena, who is a friend, and so I'm always grinning when I talk about her. She's an expert in urban policy, politics, civil rights, and community mobilization over the last 15 years, with experience in strategic planning, government relations, stakeholder engagement, as well as program management. She's a former White House official in the Obama administration and a frequent commentator at MSNBC whenever I can catch it. And Elena provides policy insights on issues related to race, law, and politics. And in her role at the University of Chicago, she offers evidence-based policy solutions to government partners and is founder and director of the Urban America Forward program, which is an annual learning exchange among national thought leaders committed to equity-based approaches to urban policy. And so I want to welcome both of you, and hopefully we can have a really good and fruitful conversation about really what's happening in our country right now with respect to voting rights. I'm going to give each of you just a couple minutes to just talk a lot about what your main lessons from 2020 are. And I'll start with Elena.
Well, there are highlights and lowlights and lessons from 2020. So for me, one of the essential highlights is that thanks to record turnout of African-American voters, the Democratic Party now is in control of the White House, the House, and the Senate for the first time since 2009. Black voters single-handedly changed the battleground map. African-American voters turned out in overwhelming margins despite voter intimidation, voter suppression efforts, closed and consolidated polling places, unconscionably long lines, intimidation from Republican challengers, both in the early voting period and at the polls on election day, and misinformation intended to discourage turnout. So, for example, there were robocalls reported in Detroit warning voters that if they voted by mail, they would face debt collection and forced vaccinations. Despite all of that, Black voters turned out in record numbers in the primary and in the general election. And as a former community organizer, grassroots organizer as well, I have to highlight that grassroots organizations crafted really multiracial, multi-issue coalitions related to voter education and mobilization. And we came out to the polls with flair, doing the cha-cha slide to the polls and so on. We delivered Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. And now we helped to decide who is in the White House, as well as change the Democratic majority in Congress. So the low point, I think, you would imagine that came before Election Day, because we were grappling with so much, everything from efforts to close polls due to politics and worker shortages related to the pandemic, but also efforts to outright undermine the post office. So we were not secure about whether or not our ballots would be delivered on time. But I think that the lowest point for our election season was probably January 6th and the effort to prevent the electoral votes from being certified based on claims of election fraud, primarily targeting those very same states that I mentioned where there was overwhelming African-American turnout. So the lesson from 2020, I think the lesson is, and I also am reinforced by Erwin Chemerinsky. I don't know if you remember, he wrote the treatise, the constitutional law treatise that, I don't know about you, but got me through constitutional law. He also agrees that the lesson from 2020 is that the state efforts, constructive state and local efforts to try to expand voting access as a result of the pandemic, for example, expanding mail-in voting, expanding early voting, making it more convenient or easier for voters to cast their ballots, those provisions work. And they work without evidence of fraud. So we had historic turnout in 2020 at 16% voter turnout, higher than 2016. And we had over 116 million people cast their ballots before Election Day. So while it felt burdensome, frankly, with everything that we were dealing with, there were creative state and local efforts to expand the franchise or at least make it more convenient for us. And the lesson is that those types of provisions work.
Well, after that, Elena, Ellen, what do you have to add?
So thank you. I'll say it's great to be here, and I wish it wasn't virtual, but actual. I'll look forward to seeing everybody together in person, I hope before too long. It's thrilling to be on this panel. I think one of the many joys of teaching at the University of Michigan Law School all these years is not just getting to work with MLaw students who I continue to know are the best in the country, but to go see what they do after they graduate. And I've been here long enough that my students go out and do excellent things. And it is a thrill to see Elena Beverly here, who was in one of my first classes, and to see all the wonderful things she's accomplished. And actually just to be responding to her assessment of the law right now, I can just sit back and say what she said. And I also want to extend a thank you to Kalila for moderating and for her leadership on so many issues in the state of Michigan on election reform, the Prop 3 measure in particular. It really, much of the success and improvement in the electoral process is due in no small part to her efforts, and it's a thrill to be here with her as well. So what to add after Elena covered it all so beautifully. And it's a great question because I like that it invites us to think about, good things and bad things that happen, because I think in all the chaos and difficulties of the past year, I at least have a tendency to focus on the negative. And there is a lot of positive. And I think, the lesson that voting still matters, that people still have the power to bring about change, that voters showed up, Black voters in particular, turned out, persevered, engaged, the work of so many volunteers in helping people get to the polls or get their absentee ballots in, and the good faith administration by lots and lots of public officials, not all of them, but lots and lots of them who worked very hard to make this possible. It should not have been that hard. I think everyone agrees. I think many people agree. We all should agree that it shouldn't be that hard, but voting still mattered. And it's important to remember that. I think one thought or one way to think about the good and the bad of last year might be to think a little bit about where we were just a year ago now, and there's been a lot of press about that, which has been mildly disheartening, to say the least, about all this happening in the past year. But this time last year, the Wisconsin primary was coming up, and maybe I'll say a few words about what happened in connection with that, because I think it highlighted many of the legal questions and practical questions that came up again and again during the year. So last March, as we all know, the stay-at-home orders, the emergency orders, the closures were starting. And no one knew what was coming, and it was a period of tremendous uncertainty. And the Wisconsin presidential primary was to be held in early April, April 7th, I believe. And as it approached, it was going to be a mess. And it was quite clear. It wasn't just the presidential primary. There were several very important state offices on the ballot, local offices as well. And what happened as the election got closer was this deluge of absentee ballot requests. Absentee ballots on demand, something you can get in Wisconsin. And while in any past election, the election administrators were processing 200,000, 250,000 applications, 1.2, I think 1.3 million people applied for absentee ballots in Wisconsin, and they were overrun. They did a remarkable job processing lots and lots of them. But as the election got closer, it was clear that not everybody, and actually sizable numbers of people who wanted absentee ballots, were not going to receive them in time. Local officials were running out of envelopes to send out applications. And what also became clear was that the state was going to be wholly unable to fix this problem. The governor called for the election to be postponed, asked the legislature to do it. The legislature refused. The governor attempted to postpone the election unilaterally. The state Supreme Court intervened and said, no, you can't do that. And what happened was federal litigation followed, and a coalition of voters brought an action in political parties challenging sort of some of the procedures, seeking either to postpone the election or to get some reforms. And what a federal district court ordered a week before the primary was an extension, and here's the issue, so I'm getting a little in the weeds here, but an extension of the time in which the state would accept and count absentee ballots. People hadn't received them. They couldn't get them in time. So the court ordered this extension. And that's the case, that sort of the first sort of pass at what the 2020 election, I think, was going to look like, because that's the case that went up to the Supreme Court. And the night before the election, the Supreme Court overturned that order and said, no, if your ballot's not in, it won't be counted. And the federal district court abused its authority in extending the deadline. And I recall the day and the day after, as reading these this news about the primary, and a student of mine actually emailed me this photograph that you may have seen, and it's a picture of a woman named Jennifer Taft, who's standing on line outside a Milwaukee polling place, and she's wearing a mask. Voters are social distancing. I don't know if we knew that word yet, but they were beginning to do that, and the masks still looked very strange. We hadn't seen them in that way, and she's holding a cardboard, piece of cardboard that she cut and with a Sharpie wrote, "This is ridiculous." And she was interviewed, and it was such a I remember looking at the photo, the student's email, and sort of just crying. How did we get to this point? And she spoke quite eloquently to reporters about how she was risking her life, risking the life of her father, who was ill, just to exercise her right to vote. And how after all this time, this is where we are, and this is what's going on, with no small irony that the Supreme Court issued its order from the safety of their own homes while this was happening. Justice Ginsburg issued a dissent, I think a famous dissent, one of her final ones, turned out, in the case in which she called on the court and accused it of bringing about massive disenfranchisement. And the per curiam, not authored, I think makes this point that no, we don't think that. If there's a problem in Wisconsin, it's up to the folks in Wisconsin to fix it. And if they're not going to fix it, the federal courts are not going to help. And we could talk endlessly about this decision and the implications and what it says about the right to vote and the doctrines that the court employed. And I'm happy to do that. But I'll make a more general point based on what happened at that moment, because I think what we saw at that point, absentee ballots are going to be huge. States are not going to be equipped to process them. The federal courts are not going to help. And that proved to be true time and again throughout the months that followed. And I think, that was a low point, if you will, or a problem, or a perennial problem through the whole process. The federal courts didn't help. And that said, we still saw voters coming out, engaging, turning out, fighting, showing up, and accomplishing what they did. I'll say one last thing, and sorry, I've gone on too long, even after Elena covered the entire territory. Federal courts did help post-election. In the sense that when these suits, one after another, alleged, raised these allegations of fraud, the courts threw those out. I might call that the bare minimum of what we might have expected from federal courts, but it should be noted that if those decisions had gone other ways, who knows what would have happened. And having them go the way they went was, again, I think, reflective of the fact that voters turned out in such numbers that the margins were secure, that some of this litigation was not able to get a hold because the margins were as big as they were in the places that mattered. So let me stop there.
Thank you. Appreciate both of your insights on this topic. I just remember being at TCF that infamous day. And so I just hearing it all sort of culminate into those moments, it resonates. I think Elena touched on it a little bit when she talked about Black voters. And so my next question is, like, what does Georgia going blue tell us about elections and really voter engagement and what impact we can have in unexpected areas? I'll go with Ellen first.
Okay. So it's a great question. I think in some ways it's the same answer in the territory that Elena covered. The importance of the get out the vote, the importance of voters registering, having a plan, showing up, and others helping them. The sort of systematic, careful, diligent work that was done by voters and volunteers in the state of Georgia and through a network of organizations. Stacey Abrams deserves all the credit that she's gotten and then some, and the scores of other people who worked with Fair Fight and with the New Georgia Project and other organizations. I see the number 800,000 new registrations in the state of Georgia, which is a phenomenal number to think about. And again, it shouldn't be so hard to vote. Our fight should be about persuading one another about whom they should vote for, not whether they'll be able to cast a ballot. And I think the other lesson of Georgia is that we're seeing the consequences of it right now with what the Georgia legislature is trying to do with these, I'll editorialize, horrific voter suppression measures that are being put in place, ending no excuse absentee voting, ending or limiting weekend voting. No surprise, looking at the way Black voters in Georgia voted and now trying to eliminate those procedures. And we're seeing that throughout the country, or at least in targeted places, the states that were the closest, and an effort again to make it harder to cast ballots, significantly harder. And that is going to be a challenge. And we'll talk more, I know, later in this conversation about federal efforts, and their importance, I think, is only magnified given what we're seeing going on at the state level at this time.
Yeah, if I could piggyback off of that, Ellen, I mean, you're exactly right. I was going to launch into a discussion of those progressive efforts that are happening across the country being introduced by Republican state legislatures. So there are 250 bills that have been introduced, according to the Brennan Center, in 43 states to try to roll back voting rights and voting access. Georgia is one of has some of the most arcane of those measures, and then perhaps followed by Arizona. Many of them are in Texas and so on. And if you think about it, these are bills that are trying to reduce, like you said, mail-in voting, trying to add voter identification provisions to mail-in and absentee balloting rules, limits. So, for example, I believe Arizona is actually eliminating their no excuse absentee balloting, even though that was passed with bipartisan support back in 2005. And so we're seeing these rules being put into place. They have a significant likelihood of being successful because of Republican control in state legislatures. But if you think about it, these are the types of measures that would have been blocked by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act before Shelby County. And that's part of the reason why civil rights organizations have been so active in trying to say that we need to restore Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And everyone who took your class will remember that Section 5 required those states with a significant history of discrimination in voting to pre-clear their provisions, any voting measures and voting changes, by having them approved by the Department of Justice. And those changes would not be approved if found to be retrogressive to communities of color. Well, so that would be Alabama and Arizona. That would be Georgia. That would be some counties in Florida, Texas, and so on. These are all many of the states that are introducing these measures now. They would have been blocked by the pre-clearance provision of Section 5. The one glimmer of hope is that HR 4, which is the John Lewis Act, actually does reform or bring back a pre-clearance measure requiring any state that has or jurisdiction that has a history or is found to have had a history of discrimination in voting, harmful voting measures to people of color over the last 25 years. It will cover them for 10 years and require them to submit a series of measures to the Department of Justice, those that have found to be most harmful to voters of color. But right now, HR 4, while it has passed in the House, it is not looking good in the Senate. And so we have another sweeping voting reform measure, HR 1, which we can talk about as well, but they have the same challenges, which is they are not going to be passed by the Senate in reconciliation. They're not eligible for reconciliation. So there has to be a way of getting a majority support and ending the filibuster so that Republicans cannot stop it at the federal level. So we're seeing, every time that there's an expansion of rights or an exercise of voting power, we start to see retrenchment. And I think that we're seeing that retrenchment at the state level. And the only way we're going to be able to proactively battle it is by federal legislation. I think it will take too long, and there will be too much harm done if civil rights lawyers have to rely on Section 2 to constantly be chasing after improving the impact of these measures.
Do you want to add anything, Ellen, since we're diving into sort of HR 1 and what HR 4 can do for us?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I was just thinking when Elena said about Shelby County and Section 5 and the time we spent in the class I teach on voting here over many years, how much of that class has become a legal history class at this point? So much time spent thinking about Congress's power to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, what record it needed, and then the courts sort of can I say cavalier indifference to the record that was before it in sweeping it away. And we saw immediately 2013, the speed with which formally covered jurisdictions enacted, reenacted, resurrected voter ID measures, other measures that would have been stopped by Section 5 and the record that follows. I don't know what will happen. I don't know if the new preclearance procedures will pass. If they do, they will certainly be challenged immediately as beyond Congress's power to enact. And I don't have a ton of confidence that the federal courts, that the Supreme Court's going to view these things the way I would view them, or what I would say about them. The fierceness with which legislatures are presently going after, non-existent problems and putting barriers up is reminiscent of earlier times in our history. And is it possible that will help solidify a case for the need for these measures? We can hope. And I think, should they all pass, going back and side by side with the HR 1 measures, could themselves, even without a new preclearance regime, do quite a lot of good to sort of help matters along at the federal level with sort of what might seem like more simple rules, absentee ballots on demand, for instance, and things of that sort.
Do you guys think that there's anything in HR 1 or 4 that could be sort of passed in the Senate? Interested to see your feedback on that, given some of the current discourse.
So HR 1 actually addresses many of these issues, if not all of them. So it provides for universal or automatic voter registration, and then universal vote by mail eligibility. It also enables same-day registration, either at an early voting site or at the polling place on election day. It requires there be 15 days of early voting in federal elections. It limits how states can purge voters from the voting rolls. It restores voting rights for formerly incarcerated individuals convicted of felonies. But I think the best way to look at it is that these national voter registration standards, an automatic voter registration system, would, one, help to make sure that everyone is already on the rolls and able to vote, and then expand some opportunities, methods for how they can cast their vote, how voters can cast their vote. It does not prevent voter identification laws, to my knowledge. Ellen, is that right? Yeah, it does not prevent voter identification laws, but it is very much about expanding the nuts and bolts of the election process for voters. It has nonpartisan redistricting as one element of it. So it would require 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 5 independents to be part of the redistricting process, and they would be independents, meaning they would not be elected officials. And that's important because we have many states that are now just now engaging in the process of thinking about their redistricting per the census count, and it offers the community an opportunity to weigh in and to object to lines that they feel that are drawn in a discriminatory fashion. It also has some unique campaign finance provisions. So it basically requires super PACs and dark money groups to disclose their donors publicly, which we have not had. And it has a public funding match for small dollar donations that is financed by a fee on corporations and banks that are paying civil and criminal penalties. So it's really interesting in that way. And then it also provides for an ethics code for Supreme Court justices, which we've never seen before. And it's timely now, given all of the Time's Up campaigns and measures that we've seen, that it would prevent members of Congress who are accused of or sued for sexual harassment. It would prevent them from using tax dollars for actually paying out some of their settlements. So it is an expansive bill. So it goes beyond voting rights, but it tries to clean up the campaigning process, and also adds a few measures that respond to what members of Congress are seeing as being challenges to ethical representation in Congress, and then to the oath that is taken by our Supreme Court justices.
So do you think any of those things might actually pass the Senate, either of you? I mean, it's a very ambitious bill, and, it passed in the House, but we've heard some commentary from some senators.
We've heard incredibly terrible commentary from senators. The Republican senators have not been quiet about their position on this bill. And honestly, H.R. 1 was the first bill out the gate that was introduced by Congress in 2019. And at that time, when it was passed, Mitch McConnell refused to bring it to the Senate floor. And so there is really united opposition on the Republican side to this bill. It has a hope of passing. The only way it passes is if the Democrats eliminate the filibuster, and that would enable them to pass this bill and others with a majority vote, and with Vice President Harris as the tie-breaking vote, right? So they can have a functional majority in the Senate, but only if they eliminate or partially eliminate the rules of the filibuster.
Again, I think Elena's covered the entire thing. Just I'll add this. I don't know what's going to happen, and it's worth to remain mindful of what's going on in the state legislatures right now, and the egregiousness of the measures that are being pressed, because that could give an impetus for the need for this legislation. I think one thing, and it is it's vast in what this bill would cover, and some of it's just like a wish list that's wonderful, but covering just so many different areas. Some of the sort of basic measures about making it easier to vote, same-day registration, automatic voter registration, absentee ballot on demand, early voting. those should be bipartisan issues. They're not, but they should be. And it's worth remembering that here in Michigan, we enacted a lot of those, and Kalila was a force behind making this happen with the Prop 3 measure in 2018. These reforms were put into place, and they were hugely important, I think, in the elections that followed in Michigan. We have same-day registration, we have automatic voter registration, we have early voting and absentee on demand, and all of that was crucially important. We could still do more. I'd like to get the 16 and 17-year-olds registered. I would like to also, and we saw just in the counting of the ballots, there were moments that we could have done more there. But I think one of the things that was so interesting about what happened with that ballot initiative that was, again, passed in 2018 by Michigan voters, it was not close. It was supported by a supermajority of voters across the state. And it also had the support of local election officials in lots of counties in Michigan. It wasn't a democratic thing. It was something that folks who had been focusing on elections saw as, good government stuff. And so it would be, it might be, Pollyannish to think like, oh, shouldn't we all agree on this? We should all agree on it. It shouldn't be okay to, deliberately make it harder for people to vote. That said, HR 1 is a huge bill. I totally agree. I don't see it going anywhere unless the Senate can do something about the filibuster.
I disagree. Go ahead.
I wanted to weigh in quickly and say, I also wanted to echo Ellen's sentiments, both about your leadership, Kalila, but also the work of some of the election administrators in the state of Michigan, like Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who was just a leader throughout the primary and general election season for the entire country, in making sure that our right to vote was fully protected, and that everyone who should have access, that everyone could have access to the ballot, and all the way to the extent of picking a fight with Donald Trump, or Donald Trump rather picking a fight with her. And sometimes when you have enemies, sometimes you're doing the right thing. So I just wanted to send a shout out to her, and to you, Kalila, for the work that you were doing. With regard to HR 4, we spoke about this a little bit earlier, the John Lewis Act, Voting Rights Act. I think that we have the same challenges in the Senate, but I think that we, as the voting public and as the general public, should call out senators who would vote against that bill, but want to invoke the name of John Lewis whenever they can, and our other civil rights heroes, but are not willing to stand up for measures that would be passed in their name and that actually further their legacy and their life's work. So I just want to point out, I think that it's incumbent upon us to point out that hypocrisy. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Appreciate that point, and appreciate both of your words on Prop 3. I still feel like we're passing Prop 3 because we're still working on implementation and seeing in Michigan sort of the drawback of now newly proposed legislation to do its best to sort of take away those measures. And I'm glad that we made it a constitutional amendment, which will make it much harder to do that. But are there other reforms, either in Michigan or other states, that we could advocate for, whether it's vote by mail, automatic registration? Ellen, you mentioned pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. And I remember in back in my mind, the discussion we had and polling about like, well, we can pass these things. I don't know if they'll be okay with their teenagers being pre-registered to vote in the next cycle of elections. So are there different things that we should be advocating for that maybe we can sort of depoliticize in a post-Trump era?
Ellen, do you have?
I'm remembering
your wish list.
I'm pausing because I'm thinking about, I remember those conversations about the 16, 17-year-olds not polling well. And it's curious to me, and I have just, free association here, I guess, but I will just suggest that perhaps this last year, will change how people think in this country. Older people think about this generation of kids and what they've gone through and what they have shown us, and maybe they will lead us. Their engagement and diligence and the work that 16, 17, 18, that generation did throughout this past year to mobilize the vote, even in elections they could not participate in, and an understanding of what quarantine has done and what has been taken from that group of kids. I don't know, maybe that issue will play differently today. There's a lot on whether how much difference it makes, in terms of actual registration. But obviously, if you're not registered, you can't vote. So it does do a lot of work. Let me say something just, I guess, relatedly on the importance of the mail-in ballots and absentee ballots, and sort of the way that aspect of our process was highlighted because of the pandemic. And we saw it with the students here at, all their registration drives, all the things that they were going to do, all of a sudden they couldn't do because you couldn't hand someone a clipboard. You couldn't sort of do this sort of face-to-face interactions. And they had to learn how to mail something, which apparently was quite new to lots of people of that generation. We have a vulnerable system. We have a decentralized system. And for the past 15 years, give or take, as voter ID measures proliferated around the country, a talking point about them when they were defended as being necessary to go after voter fraud was this argument, you don't need that for voter fraud. Like if you care about voter fraud, you should look at absentee ballots. Because no one's going into polling places pretending to be someone else. Voter ID has been shown to be wholly unrelated to any existing problem. There's no showing that people do that in any numbers or that voter ID would catch anyone. And so as these measures came up, not the answer so much, but a response was, you don't care about fraud, legislatures that are enacting these, because you're not going after places where there were fraud. Now that said, as we now have seen a very different need for absentee ballots and a different population using them, this argument has been flipped on its head somewhat. And I think it's worth to sort of push back hard on the claims. If there is fraud in absentee ballots, it's still very negligible. There are some instances. There is a horrific incident in North Carolina in 2018. This was the Dan McCready, Mark Harris congressional race, in which there was a wholly corrupt, terribly ugly ballot harvesting measure targeting Black voters, older Black voters in particular, in which ballots were quite literally marked and thrown away. And that election did get thrown out because of it. That was real fraud. It's not endemic to the absentee ballot process. It raises serious questions in going forward about harvesting, about how we're going to go about that. But I do think it's important to sort of press going forward that mail-in ballots are immensely safe, and that these allegations and claims about fraud, even acknowledging instances in which it occurred, ought not to be the basis for wholesale repudiation that we're seeing around the country for, again, something that should be a good government measure. And it's no surprise, I think, that absentee ballot, mail-in balloting was not challenged 10 years ago when the thought was different people were using it. And now when there's a different perception about who is voting that way, all of a sudden it becomes an issue that particular legislatures are seeking to limit. And that is a concern, and that would be a place I think there should be bipartisan support. There should be, whether there will be, there should be bipartisan support for maintaining meaningful absentee ballots.
I think that's an important point, Ellen, about how the conversation around absentee ballots has changed, because in doing the work in Michigan, getting people that look like me willing to drop off their ballot to not have it go into a machine sort of brought back memories of, well, if they know that I voted it, is it going to make it to count? And having to have things in place like secure drop boxes and clerks that they trust, and making sure that they had those avenues to trust that even if they use the mail-in process, that their vote actually got there. So tracking, using absentee ballot tracking with the Secretary of State was very useful. But those are things that are definitely, to the extent that we sort of expand access around vote by mail, we can't do it without sort of using the technology that's available to track those and to make people feel at least that their vote actually got to where it should be and actually ends up in the ballot box. Elena, you have any points to make?
No, I was just reflecting on what Ellen was saying about when another population, another demographic, and another party, honestly, was using absentee balloting more often. We didn't see or hear of the same claims of fraud and concern over ballot integrity. And William Barber is quoted as saying, "Yeah, when democracy works, it must be fraud," right? And I'm also reflecting on the fact that the Voting Rights Act, but I keep harping back on this, while expanding absentee balloting and expanding mail-in voting and early voting should be bipartisan approaches to expanding our voting rights. Right now they aren't, but it used to be that the Voting Rights Act and measures like this were bipartisan, and John Lewis has a quote about how the truth doesn't change, that the solutions that were developed long ago can still be the answers to the challenges of our time. And it's just interesting to me that we cannot, it seems so difficult to try to get bipartisan support of these measures that actually undergird our democracy and improve and expand our democracy, that it's perceived as being such a partisan issue.
Right. So we talked a little bit about I'll call it the myth of voter fraud. Just give you both an opportunity to sort of, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's not a myth. I'm thinking I'm not, but should we be concerned about voter fraud? And what role does really, I'll call it misinformation, play into sort of that perception about worrying about people voting and mass voting and ballot harvesting? We can go to Elena.
I should have an answer to this, but this is where you're going to have to time me out and go to Ellen, because I was like, okay, that's all the information that's in my head. I did not have enough time to research it. I'm like, I mean, no worries. Concerned about voter fraud, and yes, misinformation exists. I'm going to admit that I would have failed the test.
No, you wouldn't have failed the test. I'm sure you could have just ran off the top of your head. But go ahead, Ellen.
So should we be concerned about voter fraud? No. I could just stop there. We should not be concerned about it. In-person voter fraud does not happen. Absentee voter fraud in terms of people filing ballots in other people's names does not happen, or happens so rarely that it is not worth, or it doesn't justify the limits that are being put in place. I might say that there's something else that is fraud, which could be labeled under misinformation, that a whole bunch of these voter suppression efforts are involving tactics that one might call voter fraud. It's not the way the term is being used, but false social media posts, efforts to suppress turnout and mislead voters about their ability to participate. That's a form of fraud that we should be talking about, but that's not what we're talking about when legislation, regulatory efforts are being put in place to stop so-called voter fraud. So no, we shouldn't be worried about the actual fraud. The fact that tens of millions of people in this country believe that fraud is rampant is something we need to be concerned about, because it matters. It matters for the legitimacy of government. It matters for what happened on January 6th. And it is fueling the efforts in state legislatures now to pass measures to go after non-existent problems, to make things harder for people to vote. And again, here we have HR 1 coming in with signature match requirements, ballot tracking, and the things Kalila was just talking about in terms of how you can kind of make absentee balloting, mail-in balloting better. So there are ways to go after things that people are worried about, but that's not going to assuage the folks who believe the election was stolen. I don't have an answer for what we do about misinformation. I wish I did. And it's part of a much larger problem even if that one's not big enough, in terms of polarization in this country and people operating on really very different sets of facts and beliefs about what is fundamentally true. And that is a huge problem that I do not know how to even begin to fix. I can say things that sound quite banal about things each of us can do on the personal level with people we confront on social media, to refute misinformation when we see it while still being careful not to amplify it. But that seems grossly insufficient to the problem of, I don't know what the last number, 50, 60, 70 million people in this country thinking the election was stolen. And that needs to be eroded significantly. And I wish I knew how to do that.
I think we all do. Go
And
ahead.
with regard to the misinformation, this is not scientific. This is more just personal and experiential. We know anyone who follows Black Twitter or who is on Twitter knows that African Americans were targeted last go round by bots and by trolls that didn't exist, but by foreign nationals. And it's remarkable that we're now at the place where racism in this country and division in this country is being so exploited by foreign actors in order to undermine our democracy and sow division, and that African Americans and misinformation toward them are offered to us, but also stirring up animus is seen as something that can be exploited. I think that with a new administration, frankly, I think that there will be more efforts to curb that, to protect us from that level of misinformation happening between us and foreign nationals. But it is something that I think for the first time, the African American community had to be on alert. And I know that I personally didn't allow anybody to follow me when I saw that they had made up names and, one tweet or what have you. But there was, and friends on Facebook and so on, there was a lot of it happening this last go round. I think that this is going to be sort of a future weapon against democracy, particularly the voting rights of people of color. And hopefully we will have an executive branch that will help us to address it.
And I'll just add there, I couldn't agree more with all of that. I think one of the, not to be even more negative, I guess, but I will at this point, the foreign influence part is a hook, if you will, where you could imagine a regulatory response and administration inclined to curb it. But the substantive conduct that we saw in 2016, the micro-targeting of communities in Detroit and elsewhere to get people not to show up, is not something that's limited to foreign interference. And to stop it domestically when campaigns deploy it, when supporters of campaigns deploy it, is also a deeply troubling issue and a problem that doesn't, I think, defies any easy solution. It's the problem with what happened in 2016 wasn't solely that it was foreign. That was a huge problem and needs to be addressed. But the substance of what they were doing remains lawful for U.S. citizens and PACs of various sorts. And again, combating that is difficult, to say something simple to a complicated problem. And I guess, the things you're mentioning in terms of education and just being on alert may ultimately be the best defense against mechanisms of that sort.
Right. It was definitely important to have education to sort of battle misinformation in Michigan. And I think utilizing hotlines and voter education and making sure that you have trusted partners to deliver those messages is important, because people typically know who they can trust and who they can't when it comes to messages. And I think we're all over the robocalls, and I'm sure there were plenty of people who were frustrated with the mini robo text, even if they were from people we value. The effort of getting the voters out, it was sort of a text every other hour on some days. But I think just making sure that you have the right information and don't focus on the misinformation is also key in messaging, because you don't want to repeat the misinformation, because sometimes that sort of takes traction. And so that's definitely a lesson we learned in the last election cycle in Michigan. So we got a couple minutes left, but before I give you both time to end on your last thoughts, I don't think we should end any discussion on voting rights in 2021 without talking about redistricting. And what do you each either expect to see and or hope to see with respect to redistricting in 2021 in light of some of the reforms in various states and given the delay in the census data? I'll go to Ellen.
Sure. So here in Michigan, we have our redistricting commission that's going to draw the maps for the first time. Again, pursuant to a constitutional amendment, Prop 2 instead of Prop 3 from 2018, and it's a promising, different approach to the partisan control we've seen over this process for so many years. What are we going to see? HR 1 also has a mandate for these commissions. None of that's going to kick in until 2030, even if the statute is passed. So that's sort of off to one side. There's a non-trivial constitutional challenge, and some might say a very substantial constitutional challenge to the continued legitimacy of nonpartisan redistricting commissions. And this was a case that came out of Arizona 5-6 years ago now, maybe not quite that long, about the Arizona Redistricting Commission that was upheld by the Supreme Court, but upheld by a 5-4 majority written by Justice Ginsburg with Justice Kennedy. It's a different Supreme Court. And some of the cases we've seen in the last year, it was a little late in the hour to be talking about the intricacies of this. We could go into it about taking what power away from the legislature. It's the same argument, whether there's a constitutional problem with a commission doing the work that some say the Constitution vests with the legislature. So that is a constitutional challenge that's coming. And we'll see where the court lands on that. Even apart from that, states that don't have commissions, we're going to see lots of partisan moves where one party's in control of the whole state. The Supreme Court has said in the Rucho decision a year or two ago, the Constitution's not going to limit any of that. And as Elena already pointed out, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is not there anymore. We'll see what happens with HR 4, but for now, this will be the first redistricting cycle in which those protections to look after and protect communities of interest, communities of color, the rules that in fact allowed for, I think, meaningful minority representation in Congress and all sorts of areas of local governance. None of that's going to be in place. So I don't envision lots of these legislatures going out of their way to protect minority communities and draw lines that allow them to participate in ways we've come to value over the last decades. Just to add fuel to the fire, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is the piece that's left. Bringing lawsuits and challenging districting plans under that provision is complicated, is expensive, and again, we'll have to make its way through federal courts that are not constituted in a way that suggests they'll be sympathetic to the kinds of claims for the aggregation of groups of voters, the kind of race-conscious decision-making I think a meaningful application of Section 2 requires. So again, we don't know what's going to happen, but that's not a promising avenue. So we'll see the commissions, we'll see the non-commission states redrawing lines. I expect a lot of partisanship outside of the jurisdictions that use commissions, and the Voting Rights Act providing the least protection that we've seen in my lifetime.
Elena, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I agree. Obviously, I agree with everything that she said, about everything that Ellen said. I would say, I would just reinforce that Republican legislatures Republicans are in control of over 30 legislatures across the country. they are going to redistrict in ways that will consolidate power. And given the growing minority, racial minority population in this country, there is, I think that we have two expectations on the horizon. One is packing of jurisdictions to maximize a number of Black folks or people of color in a jurisdiction and limit voting power to the election of, for example, one congressperson, or dilution and spreading out voters and so in a way as to protect the voting power of incumbents. And so it's sort of a grim forecast when it comes to the redrawing of our districts.
Appreciate both of your insights on that. And with that, I'm going to ask that you give your last thoughts. And I'm going to start with you, Ellen, so you don't have to say ditto to what Elena says, and Elena can do the same, have the same benefit that you had earlier.
Yeah. So I think it's, there's so much to be disheartened about. And we sort of have in this conversation shifted to the more disheartening components of what lies ahead. And there's also reason for hope, and that there are meaningful proposals in Congress right now that could do a lot of good on these fronts, is, no small thing. And is the product of an effort of lots and lots of people who had faith that the system will address some of these problems. It's not going to be smooth sailing. We're going to see all these, voter suppression efforts. We're going to see redistricting problems. We're going to see misinformation, foreign interference, local interference, and all that stuff is going to continue. But, we can remember, Georgia. We can remember millions of people coming out in the middle of a global pandemic and, making sure their voices are heard and actually, causing real change in this country. And that's worth, celebrating and remembering and not letting our guard down, but, keeping up the good fight. And again, there's hope. There's a lot of good proposals. We saw in Michigan in 2018, we see HR 1 now. There are things that can move the ball forward, and even with the setbacks that we know are coming.
Thank you for that, Elena.
I think some things to be hopeful for or hopeful about. I think that the election administrators like Jocelyn Benson, who worked across party lines with other secretaries of state across the country to help be defenders of our democracy last go round, that gives me hope. I think that means that we can be assured that we won't fall below a certain threshold, hopefully, and that we can eventually work across party lines to get some of the voter access measures that we think are necessary. We can get them across the finish line. I will say that on a more personal level, the thing that gives me hope is a woman named Miss Sharon who stood behind me in line for 3 hours as we waited to early vote and was undeterred, who brought her chair. And I think that will always, unfortunately, always be the case that while there will be forces that believe that they can deny or suppress the Black vote, that we as a community will always understand how important that voting power is to us, and show up and show out to ensure that our voices are heard.
Well, thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Elena. Always a pleasure to see and hear from you. This was fun, and hopefully our alumni had a good experience and found this panel helpful.
It was so good to see you both. It was so good to see you
all
both.
of you. Yes, I wish we could have a
I know it's like
together and hang
we're
out.
close. We're close.
We're close. We'll have to do it soon.
We got a couple months left, I think, but hopefully.
And Ellen, thank you for everything that you have done to help me and make sure that you launched my profession, my career. So thank you. Thank you for giving me
I'll say right back at you, like this job every year. There's this amazing group of people who are always 24 who come into my classroom, and it is just a joy to see the amazing things that you've done, that your classmates have done. It gives me hope that if there's something to be discouraged about, there's something to be hopeful about, which is this group of people from this law school who've gone out and done such extraordinary things. So I have faith in, and the folks who are here now, the students who are sitting in your old seats are keeping up the good work. So we can all be encouraged from that too.